make America great again. How can you be against?
We are not going back.
Welcome to Sidebar from the Washington Post. I'm your host, Libby Casey, and I'm joined this week by my political partner in all things, James Hohmann, columnist and editorial writer, and our special guest, national political reporter, Michael Scherer. Michael, thank you so much for being with us. So today we're going to talk about just what $1 billion gets you on a campaign trail this year. We're going to dive into some of Michael's reporting from the trail and also from talking to the campaigns. And we're going to try to tackle this big question that, of course, everyone wants to know the answer to, which is who will win the presidential race and what does it really take to get there? We'll talk about the energy on the campaign trail, how things are trending, and we'll talk about whether the two candidates at the top of the ticket are succeeding in running the kinds of campaigns they want to. We'll also look specifically at the path to victory, needing those 270 electoral votes. And for that, we'll be joined by our principal data scientist, Lenny Bronner. But first, let's start with the news that's really dominating the headlines right now, which are the double hurricanes that the South has had to deal with. So right now, people aren't just getting their news from turning on the television. They're getting their news through all sorts of other sources. And Twitter is awash in BS right now, just total crazy conspiracy theories and falsehoods about the hurricane response, about what caused the hurricane. And it's breaking through not just on Twitter, but also on TikTok, where people are screenshotting it and amplifying it there. Do you guys know what I'm talking about? I mean, it's real. And the thing is that's different this time, I feel like, is the Republican leadership is running with it. They're not just sort of winking at it. They're actually perpetuating it, Michael.
Well, yeah, and you've actually had some remarkable moments where Republican politicians, local Republican politicians in North Carolina, members of the House Republican caucus have come out and said, this is not true. Stop saying these things. It's actually hurting our efforts to do recovery in these places. If you tell people there is no help coming or you can't get help and spread those falsehoods, people who need help may not seek it out. And that help is available. You know, money is flowing. There was a ridiculous story. It was really driven by Fox News a few days ago where the Department of Homeland Security Director Mayorkas said, we have plenty of money to pay for everything we need right now, but in the future, we're going to need more appropriations. And so Fox took that to say FEMA is broke. The government has no money right now, which is not true. It's not what he said. And Fox News' own reporters have started fact-checking their hosts because they took it as a political hit to sort of paint this story of chaos. But so far, I mean, this is a horrible situation. There's a lot of pain and agony, but there have not been stories about government mismanagement like we had with Katrina back in the mid 2000s with George W. Bush. Now, we don't know what's going to happen in the coming days. The Florida hurricane just hit, so hopefully things go smoothly there as well.
Yeah. James?
Yeah, I mean, it is kind of in some ways good news that Florida is not a swing state anymore, where the election is coming down to Florida. In the old days of, not that long ago, we would talk about the Interstate 4 corridor, which cuts from Tampa to Orlando, Tampa sort of squarely in the bullseye of the storm. And, remarkable images of the roof coming off Tropicana Field where the Tampa Bay baseball team plays, where there was kind of the water being pulled out of Tampa Bay as the storm came in. And you see how politicized everything has become. And you can imagine that it would be, a factor of 10 if it really did feel like circa 2000, this election was going to come down to a few hundred votes in Florida.
And when you say it's a good thing that it's not a swing state, you're not at all implying
I'm
that
not
it's
implying
good.
that
The
it's good
Republican
that
state
Trump
was
has taken
hit
it
by
away.
a hurricane at all.
What I'm saying is that it's that you talk about like access to the ballot and people who've been displaced, mandatory evacuations.
Right. The fate of the nation is not determined by like how Florida votes.
Exactly.
Solely.
And so that Trump's going to win Florida. And what I'm saying is that it's the misinformation and everything, I think, would be even worse in this case.
One thing that's fascinating is that some of Trump's former employees and people who'd worked in the White House are now coming out with these stories and reminding people in campaign ads for Kamala Harris about how Trump was allegedly making decisions on where to send aid based on voting when there were fires in California and, disaster in Puerto Rico. And that's not something that's like even talked about right now with Joe Biden, right? That's not like a real thing right now.
Yeah, I mean, the other one was that Trump at one point accused the Biden administration of pulling money out of FEMA to pay for migrants coming across the border. It's not true. It's not happening. I mean, it's true that the Department of Homeland Security funds both things. But it's also true that if you go back to the Trump presidency, there was a moment where he took money, not in the middle of a hurricane or a disaster, but he took money that was said to be going to FEMA to deal with the border. So it's something he actually had done that he was accusing Biden falsely of doing. So, yeah, I think the caution here is that, especially as we get closer to an election, especially with this candidate right now, although both parties do this, voters have to be really careful about where they're getting their information from, because there's a huge incentive to make up baloney and fool people in the final weeks. And a lot of it happens. And there's really, so few guardrails left in terms of being able to moderate that stuff. It just, you have to figure out who your trusted sources are and go there.
Right. Well, you're one of my trusted sources, yes. Michael. So as are you, James. So I want to read a headline of a piece that you just had in the paper, Michael. Harris campaign concerned about money after raising $1 billion. Yeah. Okay, those were two different things that kind of blew my mind. How do you raise $1 billion so quickly? Yeah. And then why are there still concerns?
Yeah, $1 billion in less than 80 days. And this is after the Biden campaign had already built her campaign for her. So you already had offices open. You already had staff hired. You already had, more than $100 million spent on television. They weren't starting from scratch. She takes over July 21st. In that first few days, she had well over $100 million. By, I think, August's number was almost $400 million. So it's not surprising that she reached that number. I think, and it's not surprising that they still need more, because we know what they're spending. Right now, if you look at the TV ad spend, I did it from the end of the convention, the Democratic convention in August through early October. The Democratic side all in, that includes the outside groups, is spending about 2.5 times what the Trump side is spending. If you look at the August burn rate for the campaigns, how much they actually were putting out the door, the Harris campaign proper was about 3 times the size of the Trump campaign. This is just a massive operation. And the thing I think voters have to understand is that Democrats are running in a very difficult year for Democrats. The percentage of the population that thinks the economy is good is very low, like something like 1 in 5. The questions about the direction of the country also very low. The approval of the current sitting president, very low. And their bet is that they can overcome all those things. But to do that, they have to run a very different campaign than the one Donald Trump's running. And right now they're running it at full speed in 7 states. They haven't been able to pull back from any of those 7 states. They have, and this is actually under noticed, there has been a pullback from some of the other states. Now, there was preparations made to actually have a campaign in Minnesota. Tim Walz basically took care of that. She's going to win Minnesota. There were concerns early on about New Hampshire. Future Forward pulled their ad. Future Forward is the big outside ad group for Democrats, pulled their ad by there. There was concern about the Nebraska 2 district in Omaha, and she needs to win that district, no question about it.
It's the blue dot.
The blue dot, yeah. And Trump made a late play to actually get the law changed so the votes wouldn't count the same. But that failed. And once that failed, the Trump people pulled out. And basically what you're seeing now is the ad spending's pulling out of that district because she's going to win it. But that leaves 7 states. There's no Florida. Florida's a very expensive place. There's no New Hampshire, Minnesota. I mean, if you go back long enough, we had campaigns in Ohio and Iowa. But these are 7 big states, and a huge amount of money is being pushed out.
Okay, so where are we talking?
So you got the 3 northern states everyone knows: Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. She wins those 3 on the blue dot. She wins the presidency. Then you have the southeastern states, North Carolina and Georgia, and the western states of Nevada and Arizona.
You can now drink some more coffee. You've passed the sidebar test. James, you've been out on the campaign trail. Are you seeing the signs of spending the money?
Oh, totally. Yeah. I mean, it is. You talk about $1 billion. Mike Bloomberg spent more than $1 billion and got a couple delegates from American Samoa.
Wow.
So it's money. Money matters a great deal, and the money is poured in so fast that Kamala Harris basically didn't need to have the kinds of fundraisers a presidential candidate would typically have.
Which could have eaten up her time.
And Trump indeed spent a bunch of time. I mean, Kamala's done fundraisers to be sure, but Trump spent a bunch of time in August doing fundraisers that Harris didn't really have to do. I think that there's no shortage. I mean, you turn on TV in any of the swing states I've been in the last couple of weeks, it's saturation, especially like around sports and local news. And it does sort of feel like Democrats have an advantage, not just in presidential spending, but, you know, when I was just in Michigan and I've been in Wisconsin, and like it's the Senate campaigns, the House races, even the state legislative races, it does feel like the Democratic money is there, the green wave that we talked about in 2018. But ultimately, what matters more than that is what Scherer is talking about, which is the people feel like the country's on the wrong track. Mm-hmm. People feel like, you know, the economy is not great, and they see Kamala Harris as part of the Biden-Harris administration. And I think Trump has a high floor and a low ceiling. I think that, you know, 47% of the country supports Trump. Trump's people seem to be like ready to go vote for him. And Harris has not closed the sale. I think, you know, if in a very high turnout election, she wins, but when you're out there, it doesn't, even though there's all this money and all this kind of energy, it doesn't feel like this is going to be a high turnout election. It feels like turnout will be lower than in 2020, probably higher than 2016, certainly in the blue wall states. But you just, it feels like there are Democratic voters to be had that they haven't gotten yet. And that's where the money can matter, of trying to get those people to actually go vote.
Well, the other thing that Harris has as a problem that Trump doesn't have is that as of late July, no one really knew what she was about.
Right.
They knew she was the vice president. They had vague opinions of her. Most of them were not really positive opinions. And she's had to define herself entirely, come up with policy, figure out how she's going to distinguish herself from Biden. And if you talk to the Harris people right now, they still say their biggest problem is reaching people. They have not, they're spending, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars on television, but a lot of people aren't watching television. So a lot of their target voters are the people who don't care about politics, don't think this has anything to do with them, are not paying attention to anything, so they still don't know much about her.
Okay, so this week she was on Call Her Daddy. She was on Howard Stern show. She was there. She
called it to the Weather Channel.
Okay, and then they were doing late night
Colbert,
TV.
Jimmy Kimmel.
Yeah. So how does that factor in to trying to reach people where they're at?
Well, that was a big switch this week, and that was basically the last thing she has control over. I mean, they're going to raise however much money they raise, and they're going to spend as much money as they can. But what she controls is her schedule, her time, and whether she's willing to put herself out there in other people's channels, basically, you know, other media properties. And she's not great at that. She hasn't been great at that her whole career. She's kind of done a middling job so far, some successes, some setbacks. And I think it's clear from the first 5-6 weeks of the campaign, she was not enthusiastic about doing it. They were really happy to run a super disciplined campaign that never had her answering a question she didn't know beforehand. And I think one of the questions in the next few weeks is, how much risk do they take? How much do they dial that up?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the places she's been appearing have been friendly, but they've been probing. Like they've yielded interesting answers about everything from like Formula One to her background as a prosecutor. So, but they haven't been adversarial, except for, of course, 60 Minutes, which Trump bowed out of. So she's getting out there more. Yeah. What is she trying to communicate, though, to both of you? Like because there's this question of the change candidate, right? Of who represents change. Are Americans hungry for change, or how is Harris trying to match what people are interested in?
Yes, it's a change election. She's trying to be the change candidate. It's harder for her. It's hard for Trump, too. He was the president. Everybody knows who he was. So it's sort of changed back to what was there before, which the country rejected in 2020. But Harris is also trying to run as the empathetic candidate, the candidate who cares about issues like you. She argues Trump cares about himself. Mm-hmm. She's trying to run compete with Trump on the economic populist front, something Democrats have been losing recently, by saying she understands the sort of kitchen table concerns. She has plans to address the kitchen table concerns. She's going to do that. She's running as the abortion candidate, a big issue for women voters. And she's running as the younger candidate, something Biden couldn't do. I mean, the dominant force of the first 6 months of this year was that the country did not want those two candidates because they were too old and too familiar, and they weren't exciting anyone. Trump has his base, but she can now claim, look, I'm a new generation. I'm something different, at least. And her polls have gone up because of that. I mean, she's gotten a reward for being the not 80-year-old guy.
What are you hearing, James, on the campaign trail? I know you're looking at a lot of like local races, state races, but what are you hearing from voters about their impressions? 'Cause we know that the reason why I'm not asking about Trump right now is because they're so baked in.
Right.
But what are they telling you about their impressions of Harris?
I think there are, when you find swing voters, and the swing voters are the people who don't know whether they're going to vote or not. Really, I mean, it's there's not some big swath of like truly undecided voters. People, you're right, have a feeling about Donald Trump. I think voters are struggling to sort of have a mental map of who Harris is. That she's a lot more defined than she was 80 days ago. But even something like ballot initiatives that I've been paying a lot of attention to and writing editorials on and columns about. Donald Trump has told us where he stands on the two big ballot initiatives in Florida where he'll vote. He sort of flip-flopped, he equivocated, but he's going to vote against the basically allowing abortion after 6 weeks, but he's also going to vote for the marijuana ballot referendum in Florida, which puts him at odds with Ron DeSantis and Rick Scott, who both oppose it. And DeSantis is like his pre-hurricane been actively campaigning against it. Meanwhile, in California, Kamala Harris's campaign refuses to say how she's going to vote on Proposition 36, which would undo a major basically criminal justice overhaul from when she was Attorney General. It is, polls show, overwhelmingly popular, but it divides the Democratic coalition in California. There's a couple other things that she won't say what she's doing. I think no one particularly cares about that, but I think it's illustrative of the fact that she's still running a very cautious campaign and that she doesn't want to upset parts of her coalition. And the result is that a lot of, she's trying to be all things to all people. And you see that on the Israel-Gaza issue. You see that on a bunch of other things. And the risk of being so cautious is that people aren't excited to go vote for you. Again, the California thing, people aren't not going to vote for Harris because of that. I just think it's illustrative of what continues to be a very, I believe, overly cautious campaign.
I want to play an excerpt of Kamala Harris's appearance on The View this week. A friendly group of people talking to her. And they were asking her about, well, you'll hear the tape, about how she is different than Joe Biden. And this gets at the issue of how much is she willing to be a change candidate? How much can she separate herself from the administration she was part of? Let's listen.
Would you have done something differently than President Biden during the past 4 years?
There is not a thing that comes to mind in terms of, and I've been a part of most of the decisions that have had impact. Yeah. The work that we have done, for example, capping the cost of insulin at $35 a month for our seniors is something I care deeply about.
That's Vice President Kamala Harris answering a question from Sunny Hostin, one of the hosts of The View. Later, much later in the interview, she circled back to it, James.
And she says, well, one difference is I'm going to appoint a Republican to my cabinet.
It's almost like it was gnawing at her mind of like, I got to come up with something. I got to get back to that. But what does that tell you? What does that reveal to you where she's trying to walk this line of she's still part of the administration? Right?
I think it's two things. I think that's an example of her having a tough time in interviews. I mean, she's not great.
Even with a friendly.
Not great at thinking on her feet and taking a question she hasn't been prepared for. She's someone who prepares a lot for interviews. But
you know that question's coming.
I don't know that she did.
That's pretty obvious.
But the second thing is, I think in terms of policy, I think you're right. She's been incredibly cautious. I mean, there's many moments here. She's backed way away from her policy positions in the 2020 race, where she was way out there on the left. But she has done everything she can to say it very quietly. She sort of whispered it. There's no big announcement. There's no like, I'm taking a stand against the left. There's no like, oh yeah, we should have done more earlier on the border. There's no effort to sort of triangulate her position in that way. At the same time, she goes out there and every time she talks about small businesses and free enterprise, and she's trying to triangulate in the positive. She just won't do it on her own side. I think that is a mark of caution. I think you could argue that it might be better. I mean, for some voters, I think that they're worried they'd lose the left if they make a big issue of this. But to come out and say, yeah, I have concerns about, some of the positions I took before. This is the difference. This is why I made my decision. And this is the kind of president I'll be. She doesn't do that in a straightforward way.
Just so we're not only talking about Kamala Harris, I just want to share another headline in the Washington Post by our colleagues Isaac Arnsdorf, Josh Dawsey, and Ashley Parker. Is the Trump campaign's male-dominated culture losing women votes? And it gets at this real machismo thing they're doing. I mean, my jaw was sort of on the floor multiple times yesterday looking at clips from everything from like Jesse Waters on Fox to just like online chats that Trump and his campaign team are having that are so trying too hard to be machismo and male and alpha, making fun of Democrats for being beta. And I want to just read to you the lead here of this piece. Soon after Donald Trump's campaign team took over the RNC earlier this year, a senior Trump aide was asked how to combat news stories that the campaign had an insufficient get-out-the-vote operation. Okay, I'm quoting here, guys. James Blair shouted, "We are going to beat the reporters into retardation," shouted James Blair, one of two men now leading the operation on a call with other advisors, according to two people with direct knowledge of the conversation. Blair did not respond to a request for comment. The Washington Post sort of called that attitude pugnacious. I think we're all reaching to figure out how you would describe that. It's very combative. It's trying very hard to push back against political correctness. But who does that lose? Like, who do you leave behind when you talk like that?
I think the question of this is, I'm not sure anyone is surprised by who Trump is or who Trump surrounds himself with. I mean, these are not a group of people. I mean, there's some total pros in his shop. There's a lot of people like Corey Lewandowski and Jason Miller have tons of scandals. Donald Trump has tons of scandals around him. The sort of stuff that would be disqualifying in most cases. I think people know about that. I think the question here is whether their bet that they can lean into this bro culture, that he can do all these podcasts he's been doing recently, which are really male focused, get around guy chat shows. And Trump does pretty well on them.
The manosphere is a term I learned this week.
The manosphere. Whether that actually unlocks new voters. I mean, he's going to lose a bunch of women voters. He's going to lose women voters. He's going to lose young women voters. Of the
but can he get young men? Can he get black men? Can he get Hispanic men?
But young men, black, Hispanic, are low propensity for the most part. And his bet is that's where he's reaching out. I mean, if you look at his schedule of what he does, of where he talks, he doesn't do 60 Minutes, which is a broad thing. He doesn't want another debate, which would have a massive audience. He wants these bro podcasts. He does his MAGA rallies, which are, I think the viewership is dramatically shrunk from 2016. They're not carried live by many people. Not many people are seeing what's happening there.
I mean, our colleagues who go to them, my team members talk about, people stand in line for hours to watch the rally and then they end up leaving a few minutes after Trump begins because they just want to see him for celebrity. They don't actually want to hear what he has to say.
And the Harris campaign at this point is saying, please watch the rallies. Yeah. I mean, they regularly say, tune into a Trump rally to see what this guy is about. It's so narrow-casted that most voters who are still undecided don't know about. So the one place where Trump is really reaching out right now is this young male demographic. And maybe it works. I mean, we could wake up on the day after Election Day, and he's really outperformed, and the polls were a little off because he got a bunch of people to vote who we didn't think would vote.
And it's possible that he wins men by more than Harris wins women.
Yes.
We'll talk more about the polling and what it's telling us with Lenny Bronner in a few minutes, but I wanted to ask you two specifically about the endorsements from establishment Republicans that Kamala Harris is getting, including from, obviously, Liz Cheney. We've certainly seen that, but Liz Cheney's getting more involved, right? She's went to a Kamala Harris event. Talk to us about who else is endorsing.
Yeah, I mean, yesterday, on Wednesday, Tim Walz appeared with one of John McCain's sons in Arizona. The campaign has sort of an active Republican surrogates operation. Jeff Duncan, the former lieutenant governor.
If you're watching us on YouTube, you can see there McCain's son with Tim Walz.
And Ruben Gallego. Jeff Duncan, former lieutenant governor of Georgia, has been doing events. Joe Walsh, former Republican congressman from Illinois. They've had Olivia Troy, who worked for Mike Pence out there for a while. And I think there was a New York Times poll this week that showed Harris is getting 9% of Republicans in the national polling. Other swing state polls show it's 2 or 3%. And the previous Times poll had showed 5%. So it's all within the margin of error. But it's also about signaling to the people that we were just talking about, that like she's not a big lefty, that her coalition, as Tim Walz said in the debate, spans from Dick Cheney to Taylor Swift, and that it's a big tent. And so I think it's about it's much about like reassuring people that she's not some big liberal as it is like trying to actually win Republican voters. But there also is a realignment happening. I was looking at voter registration data in Pennsylvania this morning. Bucks County, which is like a, suburban, it was like, kind of Mitt Romney voters on the main line in outside Philadelphia. It long had a Republican registration advantage. Now, for the first time, it has a Democratic registration advantage. But the realignment means that Luzerne County, which was an old school Democratic county, Trump won it in 2016 and 2020, but it now for the first time has a Democratic registration advantage. And so there is this
Democratic registration advantage?
a Republican.
Okay.
A Republican registration advantage for the first time.
Yeah.
Democrats, the ancestral Democrats had. And so it cuts both ways. Yeah. And a lot of those Republicans who are out there, a lot of them sort of triggered by January 6th, post 2020, but they sort of represent this realignment that's happening in our politics.
We'll talk more about that in just a moment. Stay with us. Coming up, Lenny Bronner. We're going to tear him away from his spreadsheets and the room we keep him locked in that's like lined with data everywhere, projected across the room, and bring him on to the podcast. So stay with us. This is Sidebar from the Washington Post. I'm Libby Casey, and I'm joined by James Hohmann, Michael Scherer, and principal data scientist Lenny Bronner. Lenny, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, Lenny, you are our principal data scientist, crunching the numbers. First of all, I want to talk about the paths to victory and the swing states. What states are you watching most closely? Which ones are the most sort of curious and problematic on trying to get a hold on?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think everyone has sort of settled on the 7 swing states that everyone's sort of generally taking a look at: Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and the Midwest, and then Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, North Carolina. But I do think that we've seen a sort of shift towards really, really looking closely at the 3 in the Midwest. That's Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. That's where we're seeing the most polls coming out right now. That seems to be where the candidates have sort of generally seem to be focusing right now. And there's a number of reasons for that. The first one that is the most obvious is that Pennsylvania is a swing state that assigns the most electoral votes. And so it's sort of the biggest prize of the 7. But also it sort of generates what is probably the shortest path to victory, especially for Vice President Harris. Winning those 3, as long as she holds on to the individual electoral vote she would get out of Nebraska, would be enough to win the Electoral College. For Donald Trump, that's not quite true. If he wins those 3, he needs one more sort of Sunbelt state. But it still makes it pretty close. And I will say that his shortest path to victory, his like 3-state path, if you will, is also runs through Pennsylvania. So it'd be Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Georgia, which would also be, he still needs Pennsylvania for that. So it does make sense that it's sort of, to some degree, the focus really is on those 3 states.
Michael and James, what states make the 2 campaigns the most nervous?
I think Pennsylvania is bigger for the reasons you just said than every other state. I think like there is a chance, there's like scenarios you can build that the loser of Pennsylvania still wins the Electoral College. But if you really think it through, it just doesn't make sense. So I think the overwhelming, Lenny probably has a percentage you could put on it, but there's some high percentage that says if you win Pennsylvania, you've won this thing because of the way it all maps out. And the reason is Pennsylvania is so big that you basically need 2 other states to make up for it. So if you lose Pennsylvania, you have to win 2 other states, basically from the other pie for Harris to be able to catch up.
And these things tend to break, crumble one way or the other. I think that's
Same word.
Well, I think it's true that like there are paths without Pennsylvania, but if Harris, for example, loses Pennsylvania, she's very unlikely to win North Carolina. You look at the demographics and the time and the money and everything. So, in 2016, obviously it was close, but Trump, it ended up being about 140,000 votes difference across the blue wall states, those 3. In 2020, ultimately, Joe Biden won the popular vote by 7 million votes, but the election was really decided by about 40,000 votes, 20,000 in Wisconsin, 10,000 in Georgia, 10,000 in Arizona. Those 3 flip, and Trump is still president right now.
Let's show a graphic on the screen for our YouTube audience, and we'll talk it through for our audio audience about these swing states, the main states that we're watching, and Lenny can talk us through. So this is a graphic, Lenny, that shows your 2024 average of polls and what the dynamics are and how it shifted over the past 2 weeks. Talk us through it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what we've been seeing for the last maybe 5 or 6 weeks has been a pretty constant race. So as we can see, even the shift over the last 2 weeks, there hasn't been a ton of shift. Two states we have no shift at all. That's Pennsylvania and North Carolina. And then even the other states, the shift is 10 percentage points or so. But, we do see that at the moment, Vice President Harris is ahead in the polls, she's ahead by the 3 states that would put her over the top. That's Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. She's also very slightly ahead in Nevada, while Donald Trump is ahead in Georgia, Arizona, and then very slightly ahead in North Carolina. The thing to keep in mind is that all of these states are within what we consider a typical polling error. So the typical polling error, an average sized polling error in swing states over the last 25 years or so has been around 3.5 percentage points. And so even her lead in the states that she is sort of leading the most in, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, all within an average size polling error. So these leads look relatively large, but we should remember that, even just small errors in the polls can sort of have an effect on the outcome here.
So we have broken our Lenny segment into 2 sections here, how to win and data. But I'm going to throw the chips in the air and kind of go back and forth a little bit because I think the data is really key to understanding the how to win. Lenny, tell me about the polls that you use to come to this, because the Washington Post has its own sort of set of standards that it looks to in order to come to this polling average.
Yeah, absolutely. So the standards, we call them sort of post-approved polls. They've been generated by our polling team. That's Scott Clement and Emily Guskin. And we're pretty strict. We really only use sort of the highest quality polls. And that's why our numbers are, ever so slightly different from those that you might see at other polling aggregators, polling averages. But they're all sort of telling the same story, which is that Harris is ahead in, 3, 4 of the swing states. But everything is pretty close. And Donald Trump is ahead in the other 3 or so. But again, that all of this is within polling errors. But yeah, our standards are, like I said, pretty stringent. We sort of really look at the transparency of the pollsters. We want to make sure that they're open and willing to talk to us about, what they're using. And then there's also methodological concerns that we have. How are they generating their samples? How are they weighting their samples? All that kind of stuff goes together. And, that's how we come up with our standards.
Tell us about the head-to-head matchup just of Harris and Trump. And we'll also show a graphic for those of us watching online to sort of see how it's changed. Talk to us about their head-to-head matchup, Lenny.
Yeah, so this is the national polling average. And, we all know the national polling average, the national, electoral, the national popular vote doesn't decide the election. But we still think that it's really important to sort of keeping tabs on what the general state of the race is. The other reason we show this and we use this is because it actually does flow into our polling average, which is in states where we may not get as many high quality polls at any given moment. Our national polling average, or specifically the change in our national polling average, does sort of influence the state level polling averages. The idea is if the national polling average is on the move, that's probably being reflected in the states also, and so we maybe make slight adjustments to those. But sort of what we see here in general is that before Joe Biden dropped out, he was behind in the national polling average and was sort of very slowly clawing his way back between January and June. And then we see the debate happening. It's not marked anymore. It used to be marked, but that obviously led to Joe Biden sort of falling behind in the polls even further. And then what we see is after Democrats swapped out their candidate, is Vice President Harris really sort of, making a move in the polls moving in her favor. The average change between Joe Biden dropping out and now is around 4 percentage points. So that's really the effect that we can measure between the Democratic candidate switch. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we can see on the right of this chart, it's been relatively constant since early, September. So the race has been pretty constant.
Yeah, I mean, it looks like she's plateaued, when you look at that chart, obviously, but it
she's ahead in the polls.
She's ahead in the polls.
Mm-hmm. Well, the other thing that's important about that chart is that Biden won by 4 points in the national voter result in 2020. So if she's winning by 2, if we assume those polls are completely accurate, she's polling 2 points behind where Biden was last time.
But she's ahead by 2.
She's ahead by 2,
but that's behind Biden.
Behind where Biden's performance in 20, which is what gives them concern. I mean, the other data point here is that if you looked at the polling averages going into the 2020 election, most of them showed Biden winning by more than 4. So Trump was basically able to overperform his polling averages. That happened also in 16. It hasn't happened as much in the midterms. It may be that effect has kind of gone away. But I think Democrats are also worried there's some hidden Republican turnout vote here that is just not measured in polls because his voters don't answer polling questions or other reasons.
Lenny, this data thus far, and we'll see what happens, of course, does indicate that there could be a smaller break in the Electoral College split, right, between voting for Trump versus voting for Harris. As Michael was saying, smaller than it was 4 years ago. What does that teach you as someone who looks at the data?
Yeah, absolutely. So there was, Joe Biden won by 4 percentage points nationally, but he only won the tipping point state, the state that sort of got him over 270 electoral votes, by a lot less than that, by 0.4% or so. I think it was Wisconsin. And that difference is what we call sort of the Electoral College bias. And in the past, that's sort of gone back and forth between the Democrats and Republicans, but we generally associate it with the Republicans because the 2 times that has actually mattered in recent history have been in favor of Republicans, which was the 2000 presidential election and the 2016 presidential election, where Republicans lost the popular vote but ended up winning the Electoral College. So the Electoral College bias sort of was what put them over the line to win the presidency. And this bias, there's quite a bit of evidence to suggest this bias is decreasing, possibly even going away entirely. I mean, I think that's, maybe exaggerating it a bit. So far, we have evidence that it's decreasing a bit. That's sort of what Michael said, which is that she's behind nationally compared to where Biden was 4 years ago. But her position in the swing states is still, seems okay, seems all right. I mean, like I said, she's ahead in the 3 states that will likely decide the election, but it's all within a polling error. So obviously there's 2 possibilities here. Like Michael said, there's the possibility of a polling error that we're sort of maybe being aware of in the national polls, but not in the state level polls, or maybe vice versa. But I think the sort of likelier explanation is that this Electoral College bias has gone away a little bit. And there's a couple of reasons that might be happening. I would prefer if we had more polls in some states that were sort of less competitive for us to get a better picture. But what is likely happening is that Democrats are overperforming slightly less in their big populous states that they usually win by a lot. So specifically California and New York, the Electoral College advantage was generated by the fact that Democrats won their big states by a lot, California and New York, and the Republicans won their big states by a lot less. So Texas and Florida specifically. And so Democrats were picking up all these votes that were sort of unnecessary for them. And that might be going away slightly. So we have seen some polls out of New York. There was a Siena poll a couple weeks ago or so that suggested that Democrats are still winning New York, but by less. There's obviously the midterms from 2022 that suggest that the Democratic advantage are going away again. And then there's a New York Times poll from the weekend in Florida, which suggests that, maybe Republicans are winning Florida by slightly more than they have been in the past, which would also be counteracting this effect.
All right, let me go to James for what do you do with that information?
I mean, this is interesting partly because control of the House is going to come down to California and New York. And I think there's a bunch of really interesting House races in California. I was just out in California doing reporting in 4 different bellwether House seats. And it is fascinating. I mean, Donald Trump is having a rally on Saturday night in Coachella, which, is silly, but he's going to lose California by a lot less. No one thinks it's in play, but he's doing better among Hispanics. He's doing just better across a range of groups. And it's interesting in New York, but kind of post Eric Adams, I think Democrats continuing to sort of struggle there. And it's possible that there's a story on the front page of our newspaper today about, for the first time ever, you could see the Senate flip from Democrat to Republican and the House flip from Republican to Democrat. that's never happened before, where they flipped opposite directions. And it reflects the closeness of the electorate, but it also reflects where these races are, which are in these blue states where there is some backlash to one-party rule, and where abortion isn't as potent as in states where it is sort of perceived as under threat. So I mean, it's fascinating to watch, but you still, to be sure, could have a scenario where Donald Trump loses the popular vote and wins the
Electoral
presidency.
And Trump's also going to Madison Square Garden
Yeah.
to play Manhattan. That
We don't know when that's happening, but it's coming up soon, right?
I think there is a date. It's the end of October.
Okay.
Yeah.
They couldn't get Rihanna at Coachella, so they went with Trump.
It's a choice. It's a choice. So, Lenny, one of your roles, and you mentioned Scott and Emily, their roles is to figure out how to weight things. Weight is in WEIGHT. How you weight different data. So, how do you look at 2016 and 2020 and the polls and how the ultimate outcomes were? How do you account for or weight lessons learned in the past?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I will say that this very much is Scott and Emily's expertise rather than mine. They work with our polls. And I don't as much. I sort of take a look at all the polls and sort of build our polling average and whatnot. But, you know, one of the things that we obviously saw in 2016 and 2020 was that there was this polling miss towards Donald Trump, as in the polls underestimated Donald Trump. And then the looming question is this going to happen again this time around or not? And there's, you know, when we look back to 2016 and 2020, we can sort of post fact explain, or sort of we can say there were red flags that we should have caught. Though I wonder to what extent that's sort of just us sort of post fact explaining it away, rather than really those were red flags that we would have been able to catch in the moment. And people who would like to take a close look at this do suggest that these red flags that we should have seen in the past aren't really firing this time around. So maybe there's no evidence of this polling error coming up. Obviously, we don't know this a priori. But the one reason that it does seem maybe slightly less likely is that pollsters have adjusted their methodology, or at least some pollsters have adjusted their methodology to account for this. And what they seem to be doing now, at least some amount of pollsters, is weighting, that is sort of adjusting the sample that they get in order to be closer to reflecting the last presidential election, and that's 2020. And there's upsides and downsides to this. In general, sort of pollsters have shied away from this in the past because it's sort of, you can imagine it's more like putting the cart before the horse a little bit. It's sort of making very strong assumptions about what the electorate will look like that are maybe sort of stronger than what pollsters have wanted to do in the past. But the upside is that there's probably less of a surprise, you know, once the election happens, because there are a lot of reasons to think that this election will be quite similar to 2020. You know, one of the candidates is the same. The other candidate, you know, Vice President Harris, is very much running as sort of the candidate that sort of is taking the banner from Joe Biden. So there are reasons to think that the election will be quite similar. And so that is one of the reasons why some pollsters are weighting towards this past election. And the hope would be that that sort of counteracts some part of the polling errors that we have seen in 2016 and 2020. But again, you know, we only know that. We don't know that yet.
Yeah, I mean, certainly some of the things that pollsters can ask and learn about is, did you vote in the last election? How did you vote in the last election? And then accounting for what the discrepancies were in terms of what people said they were going to do versus what the ultimate results were going to be.
And the campaigns are struggling with this too, not just at the presidential level. I was in Michigan last week and walked with Tom Barrett, the Republican candidate in the 7th district, where Elisa Slotkin is running for Senate. So it's an open seat. And it was fascinating. Like, he just was musing about how hard it is to poll. And like, is there this hidden Trump effect? And that he ran 2 years ago and lost by 5 points, but he wasn't trying to pitch me that there was this like hidden Trump vote out there, but he was like, there might be all these people who didn't vote in the midterms, but are going to show up to vote. And if they do, I'm going to win. And if they don't, I won't. I mean, this is something that preoccupies the candidates too, because they're struggling to account for these changes in their own modeling.
Yeah, but polling is really good at figuring out the opinions of a select group of people.
Right.
It's not really good at figuring out what turnout's going to be. And so you can ask people, do you plan to vote? Do you expect to vote? You can look at their vote history. You can match it to the voter file. You can do all these things, but every election is different. And maybe turnout will be way lower than 2020. So the 2020 model isn't great. Maybe like 2016 will be higher than people expected. Maybe there is, a Trump bro vote that's going to come out in force that no one's seeing right now. Maybe, women and suburban college educated voters are going to come out like they have in the recent midterms in massive numbers to sort of keep Trump out of the White House. And the best part of democracy is no one controls it. It's up to the voters.
Lenny, any closing thoughts from you? Anything that you're musing on or is keeping you awake at night?
Yeah, one thing that is keeping me awake at night is sort of this point I made earlier about, some pollsters are weighting towards 2020 and some pollsters are not. And so, what we usually do is we get a lot of polls and then we sort of don't know which ones are better and which ones are worse. And so we take an average over them. And that's what we do. And that's what all the polling aggregators do, basically. But, if that's really true that some pollsters are measuring something very different from others, I do think that it opens the question a little bit of whether taking an average over these polls that are sort of fundamentally different is really the right thing to do. And shouldn't we be sort of considering more which of those two things do we think is more likely, and then placing a bet sort of on one of these two outcomes? One of these outcomes means the election will look like 2020, and one of these outcomes suggests that Vice President Harris is slightly further ahead. And at the moment, we're sort of taking an average over them and sort of saying like, well, maybe the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Which is possible, but I think it's more likely that the truth is just within one of those two camps, and we're going to know more on November 5th, or maybe it'll be November 6th or 7th or so. But
10th,
it would
11th,
be someone will be right and someone will be wrong in all likelihood, and that does worry me a little bit that we're not taking that seriously. And I say this, we're not, myself included, in our polling average, that we are sort of trying to pretend as if these polls are all the same when they really might not be.
Fascinating. Final thoughts from you guys.
Well, we got 3 weeks.
Yeah.
I mean, I think this is going to be an incredibly noisy, stressful 3-week stretch. The Democratic campaign from when Biden was the candidate was based on sort of creating a sense of panic in the country to get people out. And Trump's entire politics has always been based on creating a sense of panic in the country about, invading migrants and all sorts, Democratic Marxists and things like that. So
People eating cats and dogs. Yeah, it's all terrifying.
So we have two massive operations who will only grow in volume over the coming weeks, trying to create panic among their supporters. And so it's going to be a wild ride.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also important to remember that people already are voting.
Yeah.
And that 70% of people voted before Election Day. So when we say they're kind of votes getting locked in, and I do think we're starting to. It does seem like Republicans are doing a better job than in 2020 at early voting and requesting absentee ballots, especially in a place like Pennsylvania. There's, Republicans feel like they're doing better. That also sort of makes it hard to model what's going to happen. You asked a little earlier, like, what is the state that preoccupies the campaigns the most? And we both agreed it's definitely Pennsylvania just because of its size. But I think the whole blue wall is worth watching. Mm-hmm. I've picked up a lot of Democratic anxiety this week about Wisconsin. And I do think you're seeing as the race tightens, more Senate races are also coming into play. And that's something to watch the next couple of weeks. I think Tammy Baldwin looks like she's going to have a tougher race, the Democratic senator in Wisconsin, than it looked like a few weeks ago. Bob Casey in Pennsylvania, Elisa Slotkin in Michigan. And that's a reflection of the fact that there's not a lot of ticket splitting. So if Trump ends up winning the blue wall states, he could carry some Republicans with him across the finish line.
All right. Lenny Bronner, Michael Scherer, James Hohmann, thanks, all three of you. Good luck in these final weeks. We'll continue to check in with you. And Lenny, we'll see you on election night, if not a little bit before.
Yeah, I'm excited to be back.
Yeah, looking forward to having you back in Washington. That's it for Sidebar this week. We'll be back with you next Thursday. You can listen to us on your favorite podcast app or find us on YouTube. Just look for The Washington Post. And the countdown is on, guys. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
See you soon.